The Krell Imperium had ruled the Andromeda Arm for 3,000 years, and in all that time, they had never encountered a species quite as peculiar as humanity. When their scout fleets first detected the radio chatter emanating from the third planet of an unremarkable yellow star, the Imperial War Council convened to assess this new discovery. What they found was bewildering. Here was a species that broadcast their position to the cosmos with reckless abandon, a civilization that had split the atom before achieving faster-than-light travel, a people who had weaponized everything from sharpened sticks to antimatter itself. The Council's xenobiologists compiled reports that painted a picture of organized chaos, of a species that had somehow survived despite their apparent determination to destroy themselves. Wars dotted their entire recorded history like stars in the void. They fought over resources, over ideology, over invisible lines drawn on maps, over gods that might not even exist. They had come within moments of rendering their own world uninhabitable not once, but dozens of times throughout their brief atomic age. And yet here they were, expanding into their solar system, taking their first tentative steps toward the stars. The Krell Imperium's first contact with humanity was not the diplomatic overture that humans had dreamed of for centuries. There were no peaceful exchanges, no sharing of culture and knowledge, no bridge between civilizations. Instead, the Krell arrived at Earth with a simple message transmitted in humanity's own languages, decoded from their primitive electromagnetic broadcasts. The message was brief, clinical, and devastating. Humanity was to submit to imperial rule immediately. All military forces were to stand down. All governmental structures were to dissolve and accept Krell administrators. Resistance would be met with the complete sterilization of the planet. They were given 48 Earth hours to comply. The transmission included footage, presumably to encourage submission. The images showed world after world reduced to molten slag, continents cracked open like eggs, atmospheres stripped away into the void. The Krell had perfected the art of planetary destruction over millennia, and they wanted humanity to understand the futility of resistance. But something was lost in translation, some crucial element of human psychology that the Krell's xenobiologists had failed to grasp during their observations. When the United Earth Council convened in emergency session, the chamber was filled with representatives from every nation, every culture, every creed. For once in their fractious history, humanity spoke with something approaching a unified voice. There were no calls for surrender, no debates about the wisdom of resistance. Instead, there was something else in that chamber, something that the Krell would come to know intimately in the months and years that followed. It was not quite excitement, though there was an edge of that in the grim smiles that passed between the delegates. It was not quite relief, though many would later describe it as such. It was something darker, something that had been building in humanity's collective psyche through centuries of restraint, through decades of cold wars and mutually assured destruction, through the careful diplomacy required when one's own weapons could end civilization. One delegate from the Russian Federation, a woman who had lost family to conflict and had spent her career working toward peace, summed it up in words that would echo through the ages. "They want to unleash hell on us," she said, her voice steady and cold. "They have given us permission, even encouragement, to stop pretending we are civilized. Finally, a reason to get really nasty." The Krell expected submission or perhaps a brief, futile resistance followed by inevitable conquest. They had seen it 1,000 times before. Lesser species either bent the knee or were crushed beneath it. Their war computers calculated a 97% probability of total surrender within the first 24 hours, with the remaining 3% accounting for scattered, ineffective resistance that would be eliminated within the week. When the deadline passed and Earth's response came, it was not what they expected. There was no surrender. There was no begging for mercy or negotiation for terms. Instead, every military installation on Earth went to maximum alert. Nuclear arsenals, carefully maintained but unused for generations, were brought online. Weapons that had been banned by international treaty for decades were suddenly dusted off and deployed. Biological warfare labs that officially didn't exist began working around the clock. Chemical weapons that had been stockpiled and then nearly destroyed under various disarmament agreements were suddenly very much in play. And in laboratories and military research facilities across the planet, scientists and engineers who had been constrained by ethics committees and international conventions found those restraints suddenly lifted. Humanity's response was a single transmission, brief and to the point. Come and take it. The Krell's invasion fleet arrived in Earth orbit with overwhelming force. 300 warships, each capable of reducing a continent to ash, positioned themselves around the planet. They began with what they called the First Correction, a standard opening move designed to break resistance. They selected 10 major cities across Earth, representing every inhabited continent, and prepared to demonstrate the price of defiance. But as their weapons powered up, as their targeting systems locked onto population centers housing hundreds of millions of humans, something unexpected happened. Earth struck first. Humanity had been preparing for nuclear war for nearly a century. They had built bunkers, developed early warning systems, created elaborate doctrines for the unthinkable. And in all that time, they had been refining the art of delivering devastating firepower to an adversary before that adversary could strike. When the Krell fleet entered orbit, they were already in humanity's crosshairs. What followed was later termed the orbital surprise, though those who lived through it had other, more colorful names for it. Every nuclear-capable nation on Earth launched simultaneously. Thousands of missiles, each carrying payloads ranging from tactical nukes to city killers, screamed up through the atmosphere. The Krell's defensive systems, designed to intercept threats from other spacefaring civilizations, struggled with the sheer volume and variety of incoming ordnance. These were not sophisticated antimatter warheads or quantum disruption bombs. These were crude fission and fusion devices, dirty and inefficient by galactic standards. And there were so many of them. The first wave of nuclear strikes caught the Krell fleet completely off guard, not because they were unaware of humanity's atomic capabilities, but because no sane species would use them so recklessly in their own orbit. The electromagnetic pulses alone would devastate their own satellites and communication infrastructure. The radiation would contaminate their orbital space for generations. The debris from destroyed ships would create a shell of deadly fragments that could trap them on their own world for centuries. But humanity had made a calculation that the Krell would come to recognize as quintessentially human. If they were going to die anyway, they might as well take their enemies with them, and worry about the cleanup later if there was a later. 47 Krell warships were destroyed in that first salvo, torn apart by weapons that were generations behind galactic technology but delivered with a savagery that made up for technical deficiency. The Krell admiral in command of the fleet, a decorated veteran of a dozen conquests, watched in disbelief as his formation disintegrated. These primitives had just crippled a force that could have subjugated a dozen worlds, and they had done it with weapons so crude that they barely registered on the Krell threat assessment scale. The second wave was even more disturbing. As the Krell fleet regrouped and began returning fire, they discovered that humanity's response was not limited to nuclear weapons. Earth's militaries had spent decades developing countermeasures for every conceivable threat, from asteroid impacts to alien invasion. Now all of those theoretical scenarios became very real. Kinetic kill vehicles, essentially guided missiles with no warheads at all, just solid masses of tungsten traveling at orbital velocities, began slamming into Krell ships. Directed energy weapons, still experimental and prone to overheating, were fired until they melted, their operators pushing them far beyond safe operating parameters. And then there were the surprises, the weapons that humanity had developed but never deployed because international law and basic decency had prevented it. Biological agents designed to target specific genetic markers were loaded into missiles and fired not at the Krell ships, but at the smaller landing craft that had begun descending to the surface. Chemical weapons that had been deemed too horrific for human warfare were deployed without hesitation against an alien enemy. And in the depths of the ocean, in hidden bunkers buried under mountains, in facilities that existed only in classified documents, teams of scientists began releasing things that should never have been created, genetically engineered viruses and bacteria designed to be selective, deadly, and impossible to stop once unleashed. The ground war that followed was unlike anything in the Krell's experience. They had fought rebellions before, had suppressed resistance on hundreds of worlds. But those resistances had been organized militaries that could be defeated through superior tactics and firepower, or civilian populations that could be cowed through demonstrations of force. Humanity offered neither of these targets. When Krell troops landed in major cities, they found them already evacuated, the human militaries having pulled back to defensive positions. The Krell expected this. What they did not expect was what happened next. The cities exploded. Not from orbital bombardment, but from demolitions placed by the humans themselves. Every major bridge, every tunnel, every strategic building had been rigged with explosives. As Krell troops advanced into what they thought were secured areas, entire city blocks collapsed on them. Subways became death traps, office buildings became massive graves, and the rubble itself became a weapon as humans used every piece of debris, every destroyed vehicle, every collapsed structure as cover for ambushes and attacks. The Krell had superior weapons, superior armor, superior technology in every measurable way. But they were fighting an enemy that treated their own infrastructure as disposable, that would destroy in an instant what had taken them centuries to build if it meant killing just a few more invaders. The Krell War Council, observing from their command ship in high orbit, struggled to understand what they were facing. Their tactical computers ran simulation after simulation, trying to predict human behavior, trying to find patterns they could exploit. But the humans kept doing things that made no tactical sense, things that violated every rule of engagement the Krell had encountered in 3,000 years of conquest. Human soldiers would fight to the last bullet, then fight with knives, then with their bare hands, and when they could fight no longer, they would detonate explosives they had strapped to themselves. Human pilots would ram their aircraft into Krell ships when they ran out of ammunition. Human naval vessels would deliberately beach themselves to get just one more shot at an enemy. And the civilians, the Krell had expected them to surrender or flee. Instead, they became a nightmare of irregular warfare. Improvised explosive devices appeared everywhere, made from fertilizer and old electronics, from fireworks and propane tanks, from anything that could explode or burn. Snipers appeared on rooftops, took one shot, and disappeared into buildings that the Krell would have to level entirely to root them out. And when the Krell did level those buildings, they found that the humans had already evacuated to somewhere else, taking their weapons with them, ready to start the cycle again. In space, the war continued with equal ferocity. The Krell had numerical superiority and better technology, but humanity had something else, the desperate creativity of a species fighting for its survival. Human engineers, working without sleep in hidden facilities, began adapting civilian technology for military use. Commercial spacecraft became missile platforms. Communication satellites were repurposed as kinetic weapons, deorbited to crash into Krell ships. The International Space Station, that symbol of peaceful cooperation that had orbited Earth for decades, was evacuated and then deliberately crashed into a Krell cruiser, its crew escaping in shuttles but leaving behind a compartment full of nuclear waste and a timer. Human hackers, some of them teenagers working from bunkers, began probing Krell systems, looking for vulnerabilities. They found that the Krell, for all their technological superiority, had grown complacent. Their systems were complex but not as well defended as they should have been. Humans began introducing viruses into Krell networks, not sophisticated AI constructs, but simple, brutal programs designed to corrupt and destroy. Some worked, some didn't, but the attempts never stopped. Every day brought new attacks, new attempts to infiltrate and sabotage. The Krell had to dedicate more and more resources just to protecting their own systems from these persistent digital assaults. On Earth, resistance movements sprang up in every occupied zone. The Krell would pacify a region, declare it secured, and within days find themselves under attack again. Human resistance fighters used tactics perfected over centuries of guerrilla warfare, from the forests of Vietnam to the mountains of Afghanistan to the urban jungles of countless cities. They struck at supply lines, at isolated outposts, at any Krell foolish enough to separate from their unit. and they used the Krell's own protocols against them. When the Krell retaliated by destroying the settlements where attacks originated, they found that the humans had already documented these atrocities and broadcast them across every remaining network. This did not demoralize humanity as the Krell intended. Instead, it enraged them, created martyrs, turned populations that might have collaborated into implacable enemies. Every Krell strike that killed civilians created 100 new resistance fighters. Every destroyed city became a rallying cry. Every atrocity was remembered, catalogued, and added to a growing list of reasons why humanity would never, ever surrender. The Krell had thought they were bringing hell to Earth. They were beginning to realize that they had merely given Earth permission to show them what hell really looked like. 3 months into the invasion, the Krell War Council received a report that changed everything. It was not a tactical update or a casualty assessment, though those were grim enough. It was an analysis from their xenopsychology teams, the specialists who studied alien minds and predicted their behaviors. The report was titled Assessment of Human Psychological Parameters and Strategic Implications, but its content could be summarized in one horrifying sentence: humans were not fighting to win, they were fighting to make victory so costly that the Krell would abandon Earth rather than pay the price. This was not a strategy the Krell had encountered before. In their experience, species fought to survive, to push back invaders, to reclaim their territory. They fought for victory, for dominance, for survival. But humans seemed to be fighting for spite, for the simple principle that if they had to die, they would take as many Krell with them as possible. The xenopsychology report detailed findings that disturbed even the most hardened Krell commanders. Humans, it seemed, had an evolutionary quirk that made them particularly dangerous when cornered. Their fight-or-flight response, common to many species, was weighted heavily toward fight. And more than that, humans possessed something the report called persistence hunting psychology. They were built, both physically and mentally, to pursue a goal long past the point where any rational being would give up. The evidence was everywhere. Human soldiers captured by the Krell refused to provide intelligence even under torture. They would die rather than betray their comrades, and they did so with a frequency that suggested this was not exceptional courage but rather a baseline expectation of human military culture. Human civilians would hide resistance fighters at tremendous risk to themselves and their families. When the Krell threatened reprisals, humans responded by hiding more fighters and attacking Krell forces with even greater intensity. It was as if the threats made them more determined rather than less. And the tactics humans employed seemed designed not just to kill Krell troops but to make them suffer, to create psychological trauma that would break their will to fight. Booby traps were designed to maim rather than kill, creating casualties that required evacuation and consumed medical resources. Attacks often targeted medics and support personnel, those who wore armor that was less protective but who were essential to keeping Krell forces functioning. Humans used sound weapons that did no physical damage but created psychological effects that lingered. They used biological agents that caused lingering illnesses rather than quick deaths. Every tactic seemed calculated to make the Krell troops dread every moment on Earth, to create an atmosphere where death seemed preferable to continued service. The Krell tried to adapt. They pulled back their forces, consolidated into defensive positions, and attempted to fight from orbit where human resistance could not reach them. This was a mistake. Humanity had been preparing for nuclear war for so long that underground shelters and hardened facilities were already in place across the planet. As the Krell pulled back and began systematic orbital bombardment, humans simply went underground and kept fighting. They emerged at night, struck at any Krell forces still on the surface, and disappeared before orbital weapons could target them. The bombardment destroyed infrastructure, yes, but it was infrastructure that humans had already written off as a necessary sacrifice. Meanwhile, humanity's own aerospace forces, battered but not destroyed, continued to launch strikes at the Krell fleet. They used every trick they could devise. Missiles were launched on ballistic trajectories from mobile launchers that displaced before return fire could arrive. Small craft, everything from military jets to retrofitted civilian aircraft, would make kamikaze runs at Krell ships, their pilots accepting that this was a one-way mission. And the nuclear strikes continued, wave after wave of atomic fire reaching up from Earth to savage the Krell fleet. 6 months into the invasion, the Krell had lost over half their fleet. Casualty rates among ground troops exceeded 90%. Supply lines were constantly under attack. Soldiers began refusing to deploy to certain regions where resistance was particularly fierce. And reports were coming back to the Krell homeworld that alarmed the Imperium's leadership in ways that simple military setbacks could not. Krell troops were developing what humans called post-traumatic stress disorder at unprecedented rates. Veterans of the Earth campaign were returning home psychologically broken, unable to readjust to civilian life, haunted by what they had experienced. Some refused to speak about their service. Others spoke too much, describing horrors that the Krell public had no framework for understanding. Stories circulated about human soldiers who kept fighting with wounds that should have been fatal. About cities that burned for weeks, their populations refusing to evacuate, using the fire itself as a weapon against occupying forces. About children who carried explosives. About civilians who smiled before detonating bombs. About a species that seemed to have no concept of acceptable losses, no threshold of pain that would make them stop fighting. The Krell had thought they were bringing war to Earth. They were learning that humans had been preparing for total war for their entire history, and they were very, very good at it. The breaking point came in the ruins of what had once been called Beijing. A Krell armored division, one of the most decorated units in the Imperium's military, was trapped in the city during what humans called Operation Scorched Earth. The division had been attempting to secure the ruins as a forward operating base when the trap was sprung. Human forces had deliberately allowed them to penetrate deep into the city, had even staged retreats to lure them further in. Then the attack began from every direction. Artillery fire from positions outside the city. Drones carrying explosives. Soldiers appearing from tunnels and basements. And fires, everywhere fires, as humans ignited chemical stores and fuel depots and anything else that would burn. The Krell division called for orbital support, but the humans had timed their attack for when a massive storm system moved over the region, degrading targeting systems. The Krell forces were on their own. For 3 days, they fought in conditions that veterans would later describe as incomprehensible. Human soldiers attacked from buildings that should have been structurally unsound. Tunnels appeared and disappeared, allowing resistance fighters to strike and fade. The air itself seemed toxic, full of smoke and chemicals and pathogens that bypassed Krell filtration systems. And always, humans kept coming, kept fighting, even when tactical doctrine said they should have broken and run. When relief forces finally reached Beijing, they found that of the 8,000 Krell troops that had entered the city, fewer than 300 survived. The rest were dead, not captured but killed in fighting so close and brutal that it had often come down to hand-to-hand combat. The human casualties were estimated at over 50,000, a ratio of more than 6 to 1. By any military standard, this was a devastating loss for humanity. But the effect on Krell morale was catastrophic. The survivors of Beijing told stories that spread through the invasion force like wildfire. They spoke of humans who fought room to room, floor by floor, refusing to yield even when their position was clearly lost. Of civilians, including elderly and children, who acted as spotters for artillery, knowing that this would make them targets. Of medics who would stabilize their wounded and send them back to fight immediately, saving more sophisticated treatment for after the battle, if there was an after. Of a species that seemed to view death not as an ending to be avoided but as simply another tactic to be employed if it served the greater goal of killing more Krell. The psychological impact rippled back to the homeworld, and the Krell Imperium faced something they had never encountered in 3,000 years of expansion. Their own military was questioning whether this conquest was worth the cost. The war entered a new phase, one that the Krell military historians would later term the grinding. Neither side could achieve a decisive victory, but both continued to inflict horrific casualties on the other. The Krell controlled Earth's orbit and could strike anywhere on the planet with impunity, but they could not hold ground without suffering unacceptable losses. Humanity controlled the ruins of their civilization and could strike at Krell forces at will, but they could not drive the invaders from their skies. It became a war of attrition, and as the months stretched into years, it became clear that this was a contest humanity was prepared to wage indefinitely. The Krell had resources, had technology, had the backing of an interstellar empire. But humans had something more valuable: they had nothing left to lose. A year into the war, Earth's population had been reduced by half. Entire regions were uninhabitable, poisoned by radiation or biological agents, or simply destroyed so thoroughly that nothing could survive. Billions had died, and billions more lived in conditions that would have broken most civilized species. But those who survived had been forged into something that terrified the Krell. They were no longer civilians occasionally called to war. They were a warrior species where every individual from childhood to old age existed in a state of constant combat readiness. The resistance movements had evolved into something more organized, more deadly. Regional commanders coordinated attacks across continents. Human engineers, working in hidden facilities deep underground, began producing weapons that approached Krell technology in sophistication. They could not match the quality of Imperial equipment, but they made up for it in quantity and in brutal practicality. Humans began fielding powered armor cobbled together from salvaged Krell technology and human engineering. It was crude, unreliable, and had a tendency to fail catastrophically, but it gave human soldiers a chance against their better-equipped enemies. Human aircraft, built in underground factories and launched from hidden airstrips, began to challenge Krell air superiority. They lost more fights than they won, but each victory, each Krell ship shot down, each successful strike against a Krell position, was a reminder that humanity refused to be conquered. And in orbit, human resistance was making the Krell fleet's position increasingly untenable. Debris from destroyed ships had created a shell around Earth that made navigation treacherous. Krell vessels had to maneuver constantly to avoid collisions, and this made them vulnerable to the sporadic but persistent attacks from Earth's surface. Nuclear missiles were no longer the primary threat. Humans had learned to launch kinetic impactors, essentially just masses of metal accelerated to orbital velocities, that could punch through Krell shields with devastating effect. The Krell Imperium's response was to escalate. They brought in reinforcements, fresh fleets and armies to replace their losses. They deployed weapons that they had reserved for only the most stubborn resistance: planet crackers and atmospheric incinerators. They threatened total extinction if humanity did not surrender. And humanity's response was to escalate in return. Nuclear arsenals that had been held in reserve were deployed. Biological weapons that had been considered too dangerous even against the Krell were released. Chemical agents that would render entire regions toxic for generations were dispersed without hesitation. If the Krell wanted to make Earth uninhabitable, humans would help them, and they would make sure that the planet took as many Krell as possible with it into oblivion. It was madness, and both sides knew it, but neither could find a way to step back from the brink. The Krell could not withdraw without admitting defeat to a primitive species, something that would destabilize their entire empire. Humanity could not surrender because they knew what happened to species that submitted to the Krell, knew that at best they would be slaves, at worst they would be exterminated once they were no longer useful. So the war ground on, consuming lives and resources at a rate that would have bankrupted smaller civilizations. But both the Krell Imperium and humanity had vast reserves to draw upon, and neither was willing to be the first to blink. 2 years into the war, something shifted. It began with small incidents, reports that the Krell military leadership initially dismissed as anomalies. Krell troops began surrendering to human forces, something that was supposed to be impossible given the Krell's cultural conditioning. Officers reported discipline problems, soldiers questioning orders, units refusing to deploy to the most dangerous regions of Earth. And on the Krell homeworld and throughout the Imperium, public opinion was turning against the war. The official narrative was that Earth was being pacified, that resistance was waning, that victory was imminent. But the casualties told a different story, and families who had lost members in the Earth campaign began demanding answers. Why was this one primitive world costing so much? Why couldn't the mighty Krell Imperium defeat these humans? What made Earth so special that it was worth bleeding the Empire dry to conquer it? The Imperium's leadership had no good answers. They tried to suppress the dissent, to control the narrative, to remind their people of the 3,000 years of unbroken conquest that had built their civilization. But for the first time, the Krell people began to wonder if their empire had finally met a challenge it could not overcome. The tipping point came not from any grand battle or strategic masterstroke, but from something much more mundane: economics. The Earth campaign was expensive, catastrophically so. It was consuming resources at a rate that threatened to destabilize the Krell economy. Taxes were raised to fund the war effort. Young Krell were conscripted for service that many would not return from. Trade was disrupted as merchant vessels were repurposed for military logistics. And all of this for what? Earth was a ruin, its resources destroyed by the fighting, its population reduced but still resisting, its strategic value questionable at best. Some within the Krell War Council began to advocate for withdrawal, not out of any moral consideration but from pure pragmatism. Earth was not worth the cost. Better to cut their losses, blockade the system, and come back in a generation when the humans had finished destroying themselves. But withdrawal carried its own risks. If the Krell retreated from Earth, it would embolden resistance movements throughout the Empire. Other subjugated species would see that the Imperium could be beaten, that resistance was not futile. The precedent would be catastrophic. So the Krell leadership was trapped, unable to win, unable to withdraw, slowly bleeding their empire dry in a war that had long since ceased to make any strategic sense. Meanwhile, on Earth, humanity continued to fight with an intensity that showed no signs of diminishing. They had lost half their population, had seen their world reduced to a wasteland, had endured suffering that should have broken any species. But they fought on, and in their fighting, they showed the galaxy something it had never seen before, a species that would burn their own world to ash rather than submit to conquest. It was impressive. It was terrifying. And it was absolutely, undeniably human. 3 years into the war, the impossible happened. The Krell Imperium, undefeated in 3 millennia of expansion, sued for peace. The announcement came not with fanfare but with the quiet desperation of an empire that had finally acknowledged a truth it could no longer ignore: Earth could not be conquered, not at any price the Krell were willing to pay. The terms offered were astonishing to those few humans who still remembered the arrogance of the initial ultimatum. The Krell would withdraw all forces from Earth and its solar system. They would establish a demilitarized zone and agree not to enter human space for a period of 100 years. They would provide reparations, resources to help rebuild what they had destroyed. And in exchange, they asked only that humanity agree to the same terms, that humans would not pursue the retreating Krell forces, would not attempt to carry the war beyond their own system. It was not victory in the traditional sense, but to the humans who had fought for 3 years with no expectation of survival, it was a miracle beyond comprehension. But even in this moment, humanity showed the characteristic that had made them so formidable. They did not celebrate. They did not rush to accept. Instead, they negotiated. Human representatives, meeting with Krell diplomats in neutral space aboard a vessel provided by a third species that had watched the war with horrified fascination, laid out their own terms. The reparations would be tripled, and would include Krell technology, blueprints, scientific knowledge, everything humanity would need to rebuild and to ensure they were never again so vulnerable to outside aggression. The demilitarized zone would be patrolled by neutral third parties, and any Krell vessel that entered it would be subject to immediate destruction without warning. And most importantly, the Krell would recognize humanity as a sovereign spacefaring species with all the rights and protections that entailed under galactic law. The Krell had no choice but to agree. They needed this war to end more than humanity did, a reversal so profound that it shook the foundations of their civilization. And so the Treaty of Terra was signed, an agreement that would reshape galactic politics for generations to come. The Krell withdrew, their fleets limping away from Earth with less than a third of the ships they had arrived with. They left behind a planet in ruins, but they also left behind a species that had been transformed by fire and blood into something new, something dangerous, something that the galaxy would have to learn to respect. The years that followed were hard for humanity, perhaps harder in some ways than the war itself. Rebuilding a civilization from the ashes is a monumental task, and Earth bore scars that would take centuries to heal. But humans approached reconstruction with the same grim determination they had brought to war. Underground cities became permanent settlements. Orbital habitats were constructed from salvaged Krell technology. And with the knowledge gained from captured equipment and the reparations provided by treaty, humanity's technological capabilities advanced by centuries in just a few years. They did not forget what the war had taught them. Every human child learned the history of the invasion, not as a tale of victory but as a reminder of what they had endured and what they were capable of enduring again if necessary. Military service remained universal, not out of paranoia but out of the recognition that the galaxy was not a safe place, that Earth's survival had been bought with blood and that price might need to be paid again. And humans began to venture out into the galaxy, first tentatively and then with growing confidence. They established trade relationships, formed alliances, joined the galactic community not as conquerors but as a species that had earned its place through trial by fire. The Krell Imperium never recovered from the Earth campaign. The economic drain had weakened them, but worse was the psychological impact. The legend of Krell invincibility was shattered, and subject species throughout the Empire began to rebel, inspired by humanity's example. Some of these rebellions were successful, fragmenting the Imperium into smaller, squabbling states. The Krell remained powerful, but they were no longer the dominant force in their region of space, and they never again attempted the kind of aggressive expansion that had defined them for millennia. Among other spacefaring species, humanity became known by many names. Some called them the Deathworlders, the species from a planet so hostile that its inhabitants had been forged into natural warriors. Others called them the Persistent Ones, acknowledging the trait that had allowed them to outlast an empire. But the name that stuck, the one that appeared in galactic databases and was spoken with a mixture of respect and unease, was simpler. They were the Nasty Ones, a species that had shown the galaxy what it meant to fight not with honor or glory or noble purpose, but with the kind of vicious, pragmatic brutality that came from a species that had survived by being just a little bit meaner, a little bit more stubborn, and a lot more willing to do whatever it took to win than anyone else in the cosmos. The war had revealed something about humanity that they themselves had not fully understood. They were not the strongest species in the galaxy, not the smartest, not the most advanced. But they were something perhaps more dangerous than any of those things. They were survivors who had evolved on a world that had tried to kill them in every way imaginable, and they had not just survived but thrived. They were a species that had practiced warfare on themselves for millennia, refining the art of conflict to a level that more civilized species found disturbing. They were clever and adaptable and utterly ruthless when necessary. And most importantly, they were a species that understood, at a fundamental level, that sometimes the only way to preserve what you love is to be willing to destroy everything, including yourself, rather than let it fall into the hands of those who would misuse it. The Krell had unleashed hell on Earth, expecting humanity to break under the assault. Instead, humanity had shown them that they were not bringing hell to Earth. They were introducing the Krell to a hell that humans had been living in, training in, and preparing for since the first human had picked up a rock to defend their tribe from predators. The Krell had given humanity permission to stop pretending they were civilized, to unleash the full brutality that they were capable of. And humanity had responded with 3 words that would echo through the galaxy: finally, a reason. The legacy of the war lived on in ways both obvious and subtle. Earth cities were rebuilt, but they were built differently now, with defenses integrated into every structure, with escape routes and shelters and contingencies that reflected the lessons learned. Humanity's culture shifted, becoming more unified but also more vigilant, more aware of the darkness that existed in the galaxy and in themselves. Art and literature from the post-war period reflected themes of survival, sacrifice, and the price of freedom. And in military academies throughout human space, officers studied the campaigns of the war not as history but as tactical guides, learning from battles where outnumbered, outgunned humans had somehow found ways to win or at least to make their enemies wish they had never started the fight. The galaxy had learned a lesson from Earth, one that would influence interstellar politics for centuries. Some species could be conquered. Some would submit to superior force. But there were others, rare and dangerous, who would rather burn the universe down than bend the knee. Humanity had proven themselves to be the latter, and the galaxy would never make the mistake of underestimating them again. The Krell had come to Earth expecting an easy conquest, another world to add to their empire, another species to subjugate. Instead, they had found something that would haunt their civilization for generations, a species that met the threat of annihilation not with fear or despair, but with a grim enthusiasm and the determination to show their enemies exactly how nasty humans could get when they were finally given a reason.